For decades, the standard Western geopolitical model viewed the Eastern Bloc as a monolithic entity. When Winston Churchill declared in 1946 that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, the popular imagination solidified around the idea of a uniform empire. From the standpoint of Washington or London, every capital from East Berlin to Sofia appeared to function merely as a remote administrative office of the Kremlin, executing Soviet directives at all times. However, a granular analysis of the historical archives, specifically the internal memoranda of the Central Committee and the declassified cables of Western intelligence agencies, reveals a reality that was far more stratified and volatile. The Soviet sphere of influence was a complex imperial system defined by constant friction, economic blackmail, and fierce internal power struggles. While some nations were ideologically welded to Moscow, viewing the Soviet Union as the sole guarantor of their existence, others were captive states that constantly tested the limits of their sovereignty, engaging in a high-stakes game of diplomatic brinkmanship to secure national advantages. To accurately rank these states, one must first understand the mechanisms the Soviet Union used to maintain its hegemony. The strength of the Soviet grip of these so-called satellite states relied on three specific pillars of control: military occupation, economic integration, and intelligence penetration. The first and most visible pillar was the military. The Warsaw Pact, established in 1955, was ostensibly a collective defense treaty against NATO aggression. In practice, though, its primary function was internal security and political intimidation. The Soviet Union stationed hundreds of thousands of troops permanently in key strategic locations like East Germany, Poland, and Hungary. These garrisons served as the ultimate veto power in local politics. A local communist leader understood that losing control of the population or straying too far from orthodoxy would result in immediate intervention by Soviet armor. The second pillar was economic, enforced through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. The system functioned on a model of forced integration designed to create a dependency trap. States in the Comecon supplied raw materials, specifically oil, natural gas, and iron ore, at heavily subsidized prices. In exchange, other states were required to restructure their economies to supply finished industrial goods and agricultural products back. Most of the time, the state supplying raw materials was the Soviet Union, which created a situation where the state's economies couldn't function independently. If a state displayed too much independence, Moscow could, and frequently did, threaten to cut off the energy supply, effectively holding the nation's industry hostage. The third, and most invasive pillar, was intelligence. The KGB penetrated local secret police and intelligence apparatus. Through a system of liaison officers, the KGB maintained a physical presence inside the headquarters of the East German Stasi, the Bulgarian DS, and the Polish SB. These protocols allowed the Kremlin to monitor local leadership for signs of nationalist deviation, ensuring that the security apparatus often answered to Moscow rather than its own government. A prime minister might harbor thoughts of independence, but if his own security chief reported directly to the Kremlin, his capacity to act was neutralized before he could even draft a plan. Afghanistan, the failed state. We're starting with the point where Soviet influence was at its lowest, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. While often excluded from traditional lists of European satellites, the Afghan communist regime was structurally a Soviet satellite that failed catastrophically. It serves as the baseline for least compliant because the Soviet system was violently rejected by the population from the moment of its inception. Following the Seoul Revolution of 1978, the new People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan attempted to impose radical Soviet-style reforms on a deeply religious, tribal society. They abolished traditional land tenure, enforced secularization, and attempted to break the power of the village mullahs. The result was an immediate nationwide insurrection. Unlike in Eastern Europe, where dissent was often intellectual or organized by labor unions, the Afghan resistance was religiously motivated. The Soviet Union was forced to invade in December 1979 to prevent the immediate collapse of their client regime. For the next 10 years, the Soviet 40th Army attempted to pacify the country, but the Afghan state never achieved functionality. The economy ceased to exist outside of direct Soviet subsidies. The leadership in Kabul was paralyzed by factional infighting so severe that Soviet special forces actually assassinated the Afghan president, Hafizullah Amin, during the initial invasion, replacing him with the more pliable Babrak Kemal. Afghanistan represents the hard limit of the satellite model, rejecting the model entirely, eventually bleeding the Soviet Union dry and contributing significantly to the collapse of the USSR itself. Albania, the fortress of isolation. Albania represents the most radical example of a successful political break from the Soviet orbit. Its non-compliance was unique because it rejected the Soviet Union not for being too oppressive, as you'd expect, but for being too liberal. Under the dictatorship of Enver Hoxha, Albania was initially a devout Stalinist state. However, the relationship fractured during the de-Stalinization period of the late 1950s. When Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes and sought a slight thaw in relations with the West, Hoxha viewed this as revisionist treason against the principles of Marxism-Leninism. He accused the Soviet leadership of becoming social imperialists, no better than the Americans. In 1961, Albania expelled all Soviet military and technical advisors, evicted the Soviet Navy from the strategic Vlore submarine base, and formally withdrew from the Warsaw Pact in 1968. To survive without Soviet protection, Hoxha briefly aligned Albania with Maoist China, only to eventually break ties with Beijing as well in 1978 when China began opening up to the West. Albania spent the remainder of the Cold War in total paranoid isolation. The regime constructed over 170,000 concrete bunkers across the countryside to defend against a theoretical simultaneous invasion from either the United States or the Soviet Union. The state banned religion constitutionally, banned foreign travel, and maintained a war economy even in peacetime. Albania is the ultimate example of non-compliance, a state that preferred to exist as a hermit kingdom rather than submit to Moscow's geopolitical directives. Yugoslavia, the independent alternative. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia demonstrated that a communist state could exist outside the Soviet orbit, posing as an existential ideological threat to Moscow's claim of universal leadership. The split occurred early in 1948. Joseph Stalin, accustomed to absolute obedience from his Eastern European proxies, expected Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito to submit to total economic and political integration. However, Tito possessed a unique source of legitimacy. His partisan forces had liberated their own country during World War II with minimal Soviet assistance. He didn't owe his position to the Red Army, and therefore he refused to submit to Soviet economic exploitation. The conflict escalated rapidly. Stalin expelled Yugoslavia from the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance and imposed a harsh economic blockade, expecting the regime to collapse within weeks. He famously boasted, "I will shake my little finger and there will be no more Tito." But the collapse never came. Instead, Tito purged the pro-Soviet factions within his party and developed a distinct economic model based on worker self-management, a system that allowed for limited market mechanisms and decentralized control, in sharp contrast to the rigid central planning of the USSR. Tito co-founded the non-aligned movement, positioning Yugoslavia as a leader of the developing world independent of both Washington and Moscow. He skillfully played the superpowers against each other, accepting military aid from the United States to deter a Soviet invasion while maintaining a socialist domestic policy. Yugoslavia became the West of the East, where citizens could buy Western products and travel freely, proving that compliance wasn't a prerequisite for survival. Romania, the independent tyranny. Romania represents a unique paradox within the Eastern Bloc. While it technically remained a member of the Warsaw Pact under the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, it operated with a degree of autonomy that frequently bordered on open hostility toward Moscow. However, unlike the liberalizing reforms seen elsewhere, Romania's divergence was to harden it into a nationalistic, neo-Stalinist dictatorship that only served Ceausescu. The divergence began in earnest in 1958, when the Romanian leadership successfully negotiated the withdrawal of Soviet troops from their soil. This removed the primary lever of Soviet control, direct military coercion. With the Red Army gone, Ceausescu, who ascended to power in 1965, began to carve out a foreign policy that blatantly contradicted the Kremlin. Romania became the only Warsaw Pact nation to maintain diplomatic relations with Israel following the Six-Day War in 1967, and it was the first to formally recognize West Germany. Even more aggravating to Moscow was Ceausescu's warm relationship with China during the Sino-Soviet split, with Ceausescu receiving delegations from Beijing while Soviet troops were skirmishing with the Chinese on the Ussuri River. The zenith of this defiance occurred in August 21st, 1968. When Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, Ceausescu publicly condemned the invasion. Speaking to a massive crowd in Bucharest's Revolution Square, he denounced the Soviet action as a grave error and a shameful moment in the history of the revolutionary movement. He mobilized the Patriotic Guards and armed the civilian population, signaling that Romania would fight if the Soviets attempted to cross the Prut River. This act of defiance made him a temporary hero in the West, as Western leaders mistakenly viewed him as a liberal reformer. However, the reality inside Romania was dystopian. Ceausescu used his independence to construct a cult of personality that rivaled North Korea's. To pay off the foreign debts he incurred by his industrialization projects, he instituted a policy of severe austerity in the 1980s. The regime exported nearly all of the country's agricultural output, leaving the Romanian population to face rationing, starvation, and unheated apartments during brutal winters. Hungary, the pacified Firebrand. Hungary was a nation that moved from violent insurrection to a cynical, pragmatic compromise. The Hungarian relationship with the Soviet Union is defined by the trauma of 1956, an event that served as the foundational scar for the remainder of the Cold War era. The 1956 revolution was the most direct military challenge to Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe. What began as a student demonstration in Budapest escalated into full-scale warfare. Hungarian insurgents, armed with Molotov cocktails and captured weapons, destroyed Soviet tanks in the narrow streets of the capital. Prime Minister Imre Nagy, swept up by the momentum of the uprising, declared Hungary's neutrality and announced its withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. This crossed the strategic red line. The Soviet response was overwhelming. 31,500 troops and 1,130 tanks invaded, crushing the resistance, killing 2,500 Hungarians and executing Nagy. Following the brutal suppression, the Soviets installed János Kadar to restore order. Kadar, however, eventually realized that he couldn't rule by terror alone, and in the early 1960s, he brokered a silent social contract with the population, famously inverting the Stalinist maxim to, "He who is not against us is with us." This ushered in the era of Goulash communism. The regime agreed to provide a steadily rising standard of living, access to consumer goods, and a retreat of the state from the private lives of citizens. In exchange, the Hungarian people agreed to withdraw from political activism and outwardly accept Soviet foreign policy. This compromise made Hungary the happiest barrack in the camp. The government introduced the new economic mechanism in 1968, which introduced elements of market capitalism, allowing for small private enterprises and deeper trade ties with the West. Hungarians enjoyed freedoms unknown to their neighbors, such as easier travel restrictions and access to Western culture. While they voted with the USSR at the UN and hosted Soviet troops, the ideological fervor was dead. Hungary became a state of pragmatic cynicism, waiting out the clock until the geopolitical tides turned, eventually being the first to cut the physical Iron Curtain in 1989. Poland, the permanent crisis. Poland occupies the position of the problem child that the Soviet Union could neither fully pacify nor afford to abandon. Poland was the largest, most populous, and strategically vital nation in the bloc, serving as the essential land bridge to East Germany. Yet, its history under communism was a continuous cycle of economic failure, worker riots, and regime collapse. Unlike other satellites, where the Communist Party held a monopoly on authority, Poland possessed a powerful, independent rival institution, the Catholic Church. The Church acted as a repository for Polish national identity and a shield against total Sovietization. The election of Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II in 1978 provided a massive psychological blow to the regime. His pilgrimage to Poland mobilized millions of people, demonstrating visibly that the party was a minority power ruling over a nation that rejected its ideology. This resistance coalesced into the Solidarity movement in 1980. Sparked by the firing of crane operator Anna Valentinovich at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, the strike evolved into the first independent trade union in the Eastern Bloc. Under the leadership of Lech Wałęsa, Solidarity grew to 10 million members, nearly 1/3 of the entire Polish population. It ceased to be a mere union and became a parallel civil society, publishing its own newspapers and organizing its own social welfare, effectively creating a state within a state. The Soviet leadership in Moscow viewed Poland with unending anxiety. They exerted immense pressure on the Polish leadership to crush the counter-revolution, fearing that if Poland fell, the entire Warsaw Pact would disintegrate. This culminated in the declaration of martial law by General Wojciech Jaruzelski in December 1981. Tanks rolled into Polish cities, thousands were interned, and Solidarity was driven underground. However, the fact that the Soviets didn't invade directly demonstrated the limits of their power. They feared that a Soviet invasion of Poland would trigger a NATO-level crisis and a bloody, protracted guerrilla war. Czechoslovakia, the broken intellectual. Czechoslovakia represents a nation whose compliance was secured through one of the most traumatic events of the Cold War. For the first 2 decades of the communist experiment, Czechoslovakia was a model satellite, an industrial powerhouse that supplied the bloc with high-quality consumer goods and weapons. However, the events of 1968 fundamentally altered its trajectory, transforming it from a willing partner into a sullen, occupied territory. The crisis began with the rise of Alexander Dubček, a reformist leader who believed that socialism could be democratic. His program, Socialism with a Human Face, ended censorship, rehabilitated political prisoners, and allowed for open debate. Moscow viewed this intellectual independence as a contagion. If the most advanced industrial power in the bloc allowed a free press, the infection might spread to Ukraine or even Russia itself. The Soviet response was the invasion of August 20th, 1968. 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops crossed the border into the largest military operation in Europe since World War II. The Czechoslovak army was ordered to stand down to avoid a massacre, but the population engaged in a massive campaign of passive resistance. They switched road signs to confuse the invaders, refused to supply them with food or water, and painted swastikas on Soviet tanks. Following the invasion, the country entered a period known as normalization. The reformist leaders were purged, and a hardline regime under Gustav Husak was installed. The social contract here was stark. The regime would provide a decent standard of living and tolerate no political dissent. Compliance was maintained through the memory of betrayal. East Germany, the anxious sentinel. Unlike Poland or Hungary, which had centuries of history as independent states, the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany, was an artificial construct born of the Soviet occupation zone. Its very existence depended entirely on the 380,000 Soviet troops stationed permanently on its soil. The leadership of the ruling Socialist Unity Party understood that their legitimacy was borrowed. To compensate, they strove to be more orthodox and efficient than the Kremlin itself. The primary instrument of this control was the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. Under Erich Mielke, the Stasi built the most pervasive surveillance state in human history, employing one informant for every 66 citizens. They modeled themselves explicitly on the Soviet KGB, viewing themselves as the shield and sword of the party. The GDR became the workshop of the Soviet Empire, building the most efficient economy in the Warsaw Pact, supplying the USSR with advanced optics, chemicals, and precision machinery. However, this loyalty was brittle. In the late 1980s, when Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika and glasnost, the East German leadership recoiled. Erich Honecker, terrified that liberalization would lead to the state's dissolution, began censoring Soviet publications. The overachiever was so committed to the old syllabus that he tried to ban the teacher's new lesson plan. This refusal to reform ultimately led to the regime's collapse in 1989 when Gorbachev refused to send tanks to save it. Bulgaria, the 16th Republic. Bulgaria holds the distinction of being the only Warsaw Pact nation that never required a Soviet military intervention to maintain communist rule. While other nations had to be coerced into obedience, the Bulgarian leadership offered it voluntarily. The relationship between Sofia and Moscow was rooted in deep historic Russophilia dating back to the 19th century when Russia helped liberate Bulgaria from the Ottoman Empire. This historical goodwill allowed the Bulgarian Communist Party to operate with a level of organic stability that other regimes envied. The leader, Todor Zhivkov, ruled for 35 years with a strategy of total sycophancy. He famously asked, "How can we help Moscow today?" The extent of this loyalty is best illustrated by the 16th Republic proposals. On at least 3 separate occasions, Zhivkov formally proposed that Bulgaria surrender its national sovereignty and be incorporated into the Soviet Union. While the Soviets declined, likely to avoid diplomatic complications, the mere fact that a head of state volunteered to dissolve his own country demonstrates a unique level of submission. Mongolia, the forgotten firstborn. Mongolia was the Soviet Union's first satellite, orbiting Moscow since 1921. Sandwiched between 2 giants, the Soviet Union and China, Mongolia looked to Moscow as its protector against Chinese dominance. The dependency was total. Mongolia adopted the Cyrillic alphabet, remodeled its education system on Soviet lines, and integrated its economy so thoroughly that 90% of its trade was with the USSR. During the Sino-Soviet split, Mongolia's loyalty was absolute. They expelled thousands of ethnic Chinese residents and allowed the Soviet Union to station the 39th Army on their border, aimed directly at Beijing. Like Bulgaria, Mongolian leaders asked to be annexed into the USSR. The Eastern Bloc was never a cohesive bloc at all. It was a complex imperial system held together by varying degrees of coercion, bribery, and genuine belief. The compliant states, like Bulgaria and Mongolia, relied on the Soviet Union for their very identity and survival. The ambivalent states, like Poland and Czechoslovakia, were trapped by geography and history. They rebelled when they could, but tanks dictated their eventual submission. The rowdy states, like Albania and Yugoslavia, proved that with enough nationalist fervor, or enough distance from the Red Army, it was possible to defy the Kremlin. Ultimately, the diversity of these relationships became the undoing of the system. When Gorbachev removed the threat of force in 1989, the empire didn't just crack, it shattered along the fault lines that had existed for 40 years. But what do you think? Was the stability of the compliant states worth the loss of sovereignty? Or were the rowdy rebels right to risk everything for independence, even if it meant isolation? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.